Hey everyone, welcome to another Jakarta Tech Talk. I'm today here with John Clingan, and John will talk to us about the microprofile and the news in the microprofile world. So um, we are struggling just a little bit with who is going to share the screen, and I think I'm the one sharing the screen. So let me just bring out the presentation. Okay, there it is. So, John,
Mhm.
click here to close the message. I close the message. You please direct me, and I will do what needs to be done on my end.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining, and I apologize we're a little bit late because we had some technical difficulties. Chrome was not being honorable about sharing my screen, so we figured it out. Let's see if we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, well, actually, Eclipse MicroProfile 3.3 an update, right? That's pretty clear from the session title. So let's move on to the next one. Who the heck am I? I am a MicroProfile, co-founder, involved day one, helped kind of create the MicroProfile project in the early days, along with a bunch of other folks. I've been a committer mainly around the releases. So you can see the releases that I've kind of been a co-lead of. More recently, well, in the past with Kevin Sutter, and more recently with Kevin and Edwin Dirks. So we're kind of sharing the responsibility and cross-training everybody on how to do releases at the project level or at the platform level. And I'm involved with a lot of the processes, project optimization, and stuff like that in the MicroProfile community. I'm a product manager at Red Hat around MicroProfile, Quarkus, and miscellaneous other things. I used to be a product manager of Java EE and Glassfish at Sun Microsystems and Oracle. And let's see, I've been using Java EE since before J2EE. So I was playing around with individual technologies like servlets before Java EE was even formed, but really didn't start using Java EE, I think, until probably 1.2 or 1.3, the J2EE days. And I also do a little bit of instruction and training at UC Irvine Extension and O'Reilly live trainings. You'll hear about that very briefly near the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. All right, what is Eclipse MicroProfile? At its simplest description, I'm going to move this slide over here. So I'm looking more toward the camera. I've got multiple monitors set up here. It's an open source community that creates enterprise Java microservices specifications. So most people tend to think of specifications and standards organizations as being very process driven and only a certain few can kind of participate historically, right? The experts per se. But with MicroProfile, we really are an open source community. We want to treat specification development like any other open source project. So normally an open source project produces, like in the Java world, some kind of framework or that you might use within your application or some tool or whatever. But what MicroProfile produces is specifications primarily. So next slide. All right, so, who is MicroProfile per se? Well, there's a bunch of vendors that you can see here that participate within the community, organizations like user groups. So you can see the London Java community here, as well as SuJava, and a ton of unaffiliated individuals, right, that aren't really part of a traditional middleware vendor. They're just individuals that are interested in middleware and want to participate in creating specifications, which is awesome. So next slide, please. All right, so the current MicroProfile implementations, and by the way, these last three slides here, and some of these other slides were created by the MicroProfile marketing team. So when you work within the community, you don't have to just create specifications. There's other ways to participate. So we have folks that are very active in marketing, and one of the things they do, for example, is produce slides like this. So you can see a list here of the implementations of MicroProfile. And one that's not here yet, but has started to support MicroProfile specifications is Piranha. So if you look at piranha.cloud, that's a new project for, I think, creating microservices, and they support, I think, MicroProfile Health and MicroProfile JWT, and I think they're going to keep growing support for MicroProfile specs. So a little bit of shout out to the up-and-coming members of the MicroProfile community from an implementation perspective. So what do we have here? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 9 current implementations. And if you tack on, for example, Piranha, that's up to 10. So next slide. So if we look at what exactly is MicroProfile from a specification perspective, there is a set of 4 specifications. So if you look at the box that says MicroProfile 3.3, and the lower left-hand kind of row, you'll see specifications that have been developed in the Java EE community, right? So CDI, the JSON specs, and JAX-RS. And that kind of defines a core programming model for MicroProfile, meaning that the specifications, in terms of dependencies, only rely on those 4 specifications. If you look at all the other boxes, those are boxes that have been developed inherently within the MicroProfile community. So if you count them up here, we got 8 in the MicroProfile 3.3 box, and in the right-hand side, you got 4 more. So far we've developed 12 homegrown specifications, and there's another one in the works called long-running actions, and I'm not really going to cover that one. If you look at the color coding, you'll see that there's a set of specifications for MicroProfile 3.3 that haven't really changed. And then you'll see some have been updated. And so for MicroProfile 3.3, it turned out to be a bigger release than we originally had thought. So you see REST client, config, fault tolerance, metrics, and health all had some kind of update to it. And if you look at new specifications, I think this is the first time in kind of a MicroProfile deck like this, we have GraphQL. I'm going to talk about GraphQL a little bit later. So, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about what does it mean to be part of the platform, which is the box, the dash box to the left, and a standalone spec, which is a list of specifications to the right. And I'll cover that a little bit. So you can see that we have 5 updated specifications in MicroProfile 3.3. So let's go to the next slide, please. And I should mention that I did put a link to this presentation in the chat, so feel free to take a look, make copies of the presentation, steal slides, and all of that. Okay, so what you'll find is when you look at the changelog for specifications, well, first of all, reading specifications is, for the typical Java developer, is kind of boring. It just talks about the very details of specs, the TCKs get covered, and how to do the testing to ensure compatibility. So what you'll find in the changelog is features descriptions. You'll see clarifications of the spec, modifications to the TCK if someone says, hey, there's a bug in the TCK. So you'll see that not necessarily all the updates in a MicroProfile spec are something that a developer will consume on a day-to-day basis, right? But there are functional updates. And so I've kind of pulled some of these out of some of the specs to give you an idea about what some of the functional updates are. For this release. And let's go on to the next slide, please. So this gets into one of the updates. If you saw, actually, I'm sorry, Tanya, can you go back one slide, please? One of the things I've done is I've kind of, up one more, slide 7. So what I've done is I've kind of color coded in red some of these things that are more, developer functionality that you might use. And you'll see here it's ensure CDI and optionally JAX-RS injection into client headers factory. You might be thinking to yourself, well, what the heck does that mean? Next slide, please. So within MicroProfile REST client, if you're not familiar with the REST client, basically it's a type-safe way of making RESTful calls to back-end RESTful services. So if you think about if you write a JAX-RS resource, if you strip out all the implementation code, that basically turns a JAX-RS resource into an interface, as long as you also change the class keyword to interface. So in a lot of ways, that's what the REST client is. You're defining an interface to call backend RESTful services. And so one of the things that you can do with the REST client is propagate headers. So as you go from your client to a service that you may have written, and the service that you've written may have to call other backend JAX-RS resources, there's the potential desire to propagate headers. So you can think about propagating a bearer token, so that if you've authenticated with some authentication service, you might have this token that you want to pass between services. You want to propagate it. So the way you do that in MicroProfile is you add the @register client headers annotation to a REST client, and that basically provides a default implementation that propagates the headers, right? And if you don't like the default implementation, you can write your own, and you'll see the client headers factory below. And that's just a very simple example of where I've kind of defined a very simple outline of a client header factory, right? You can implement your own and define your own strategy about how you want to propagate a header, what headers you might want to propagate, maybe manipulate a header in between the browser that talks to your service and the service in the back end. And so basically now, if you annotate that with add application scope, it'll be automatically discovered. Otherwise, you'd have to provide it as a parameter to the annotation, register client headers. So this is just an example of, with MicroProfile, what you'll find is we don't tend to have these big bang releases of specs. What we do have is a lot of incremental releases that add functionality along the way. So you don't have to wait a year, 2 years, 3 years, or whatever and get just a ton of features. What you'll find is that through the MicroProfile community, either developers will come directly to the community and ask for features, or through the implementations that you saw on the previous slide, they'll talk to the folks that implement MicroProfile, and then they'll take that customer or user feedback and provide these this feedback to the MicroProfile community, and then these get eventually pushed into MicroProfile spec updates. So this is not necessarily a feature that you would use all the time within MicroProfile. It's a little bit one of the more infrequently used one, but when you need it, you need it, and you want to be able to customize it, right? So that's kind of what this facilitates. Next slide. Okay, so with let's see, REST clients. This, and I apologize, this is a bug. REST client here. This should show. This should be the configuration, MicroProfile config. So I apologize for that. That's not. I'll fix the slide title after the talk. But basically, again, you'll see there's lots of kind of esoteric updates around API, SPI, and TCKs and stuff. But one of the things you'll see is that, again, in bold red, you'll see that we've added additional converters. So with MicroProfile config, it lets you externalize your configuration. So that means, in your application, you can inject a property value, and that property value could be in an environmental variable, a property file, on the command line, in a database, right? Wherever. And it's assumed that those are basically ASCII, a string, right? Environmental variable, property files. And so what you want to be able to do is convert those strings into some kind of native data type within MicroProfile in your Java app. So there's a built into the spec, you can convert from string to pretty much all the basic Java types. And this, with MicroProfile config 1.4, we kind of finished that off. There were a couple of missing ones, and you can see those here: bytes, shorts, and characters. So you could have already have done the numeric types, strings, booleans, even lists and arrays. But we've kind of closed the loop now, where you got basic support for all the base types within Java, right? And you can see a very simple injection of a simple property, a character, into an instance variable within your class. So again, another incremental style update. Next slide, please. Okay, fault tolerance. So within MicroProfile, you have the ability to react to how do I want to say this? Troublesome situations, right? If you have some kind of issue within your application, then there's ways to kind of deal with these issues using fault tolerance annotation. So what does that mean? We have timers. So if a method is taking too long to invoke a backend, you can basically throw a timeout exception, right? It took too long. There's a fallback. So if something takes too long, maybe you want to provide alternative or fallback logic. So there's a fallback annotation. We have circuit breakers, bulkheads, asynchronous annotation for running code in a separate thread. So there's lots of strategies for dealing with potential failures in your application. And so what I've done here is I've called out on this slide again in red a couple of more functional, developer functional features that were updated in fault tolerance 2.1. So what you'll find is with fault tolerance, a lot of the functionality is influenced by exceptions, right? So yeah, extend the slide, please. Thank you. And what that means is that when something goes wrong, you might want to throw an exception. Or if something goes wrong, then one of these annotations might throw an exception. So for example, if you have a timeout and your code takes too long, it'll throw a timeout exception, right? So what you'll want with fault tolerance is the ability to have some level of flexibility and control over how to deal with exceptions. So if you go on to the next slide, please. This is an example with the fallback annotation. Basically, if you threw any kind of exception, it would automatically kind of, and if it wasn't caught within your code, it would call the fallback. But what you might want to have is some additional control over your fallback. So in this case, what we're saying is, well, first of all, what I'll do is talk a little bit about this code in my unstable method. So one of the things it does is it sleeps for a random amount of time, between 0 and 2 seconds, right? The second thing it'll do is if some business logic, if some error condition occurs, this will throw a custom exception, right? So what this means is that there's some cases here where some exceptions are going to be thrown, and you want to have some control. So if you look at the timeout exception, this is a fault tolerance annotation in MicroProfile. By default, add timeout sleeps for 1 second or 1,000 milliseconds. So if you look at that code, half the time, because of the random sleep, half the time it's going to fail, and half the time it's going to succeed. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that for that exception, we call the callback method, right? But if I run into some business logic exception, maybe I don't want to call the fallback. Maybe I want that exception to propagate up to somewhere else in my stack, to some other method. So what we're saying in this, with the new skip on parameter, what we're doing is we're saying, skip on the my customer exception net class. Don't call the fallback on my custom exception. Only call the fallback on the timeout exception, right? So it gives you some flexibility, and there's again additional flexibility in the circuit breaker annotation as well. So that's very useful functionality for day-to-day fault-tolerant style microservices coding. Next slide. And it said REST client. Boy, I really have to fix my slide titles. I apologize. That should have been a fault tolerance example. All right, here's metrics 2.3. Metrics 2.3, again, lots of TCK enhancements, clarifications around the spec. And I called out a couple of functional API changes that might be useful for a developer on kind of a day-to-day basis. One is the introduction of a simple timer. So MicroProfile metrics already has an add timed annotation, but it's pretty verbose. And you'll see an example of that. And sometimes you just want to see how long did a method take, give me a time, and not a lot of verbose output. And so there's a new annotation, add simply timed, that will just time, for example, a method call or a constructor, or you can do it at the class level and it'll time every method. And then there's another added to MicroProfile metrics is process CPU time. So with MicroProfile metrics, there's 3 classes of metrics. One is base. That means every MicroProfile implementation has to provide a base set of metrics. Typically, it's around class loading metrics, memory utilization like heap size and heap utilization, and process or CPU utilization on the system. So there's a new basic metric added. Says, well, for this process that's executing, your code, how much CPU time is this process using? And so what you can do then is take that information, and there's also a CPU count metric that tells you how many CPUs are in the system. You could push both of those to some back-end metrics collection system like Prometheus, and then Prometheus can maybe do some calculation on that and say, well, what percentage of the CPU is your process using? Right? So it takes the calculation outside of your code and moves it off to some kind of back-end system. So let's take a look at the next slide, please. And so this is that verbose output I was telling you about, right? If I add timed to a method, in this case it's called list students, you can see that it gives you an awful lot of data, right? If all you want to find out is how long did the method take, right? And you look at this, it's like, good luck, right? So what simply timed will do is just take a look at one of these lines, right? It'll say, okay, this is how long this method took, right? So I haven't actually run the code to see what the output looks like yet, because the implementations I use haven't implemented this quite yet. Keep in mind, MicroProfile is only about a week. 3.3 is only about a week old, a week or 2 weeks. 18th. So yeah, 18th is when it was released. So, but you can imagine this being a very short output of just maybe one line. So that was added basically to do 2 things. Again, take the calculation, all this calculation out of your microservice. And if you don't need all of this detailed information, and provide just one line of output that makes it a lot simpler, more targeted to the use case that you're trying to do, which is how long does a method take? Okay, next slide, please. Health 2.2. So Health 2.2 went through an update, so you can see there's a couple of, again, examples around whether it's a spec update or a TCK modification. These are important things for implementations that want to implement MicroProfile specs, but not necessarily for you, the end developer. One of the things, and I apologize, I didn't actually get an example of for this one, but make health check response a concrete class. What this means is health check response. Well, so first of all, health. MicroProfile Health is an API that lets you expose the health of your service to the underlying platform. So think Docker, think Kubernetes. It can expose whether your service is alive, right? Is it up and running without any kind of issues? And there's also a readiness health definition. Is my service ready to accept traffic. So what that means is with liveness, if your service is not live for some period of time, it'll restart the container. For the underlying infrastructure will. For your application with a readiness check, your application might be live, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not ready to serve traffic. So an example is maybe it's going to read some data out of a database and cache it within the service, right? And it takes time to do that. During that time, you don't want to receive traffic, so you say, I'm not ready yet, right? And once you've maybe primed the cache, then you say, okay, I'm ready. And then the underlying infrastructure will direct traffic your way. So the way you reply to the underlying infrastructure is using a health check response object. And that's where you basically define the state, yes, I'm ready, or no, I'm not ready, or there's an issue, status is good or bad. Here's some additional data that you might want to provide as well. Think of it as just like a hash map. It's an abstract class, which means you can't use it in all the cases. And when I looked at the issue, it basically says you want to use it inside of the MicroProfile REST client, and you can't because it's an abstract class. So basically, they make it a concrete class, and now you can use a health check response in your MicroProfile REST client interface. So this is one again that you might want to utilize. The exact use case where this popped up was, what if I don't want to rely on Kubernetes or Docker to receive my health? What if I want to write a custom Java client that pings my service and gets the status out, the health of the service out using a Java client, and you want to use the MicroProfile REST client to do that? Well, this actually allows you to do that. And I apologize, I didn't have time to actually get a code sample in there, so my description may not do it justice. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think people don't think about as a user, but it becomes very apparent, when you're working on the specs, is the amount of integration that's been, and the thought that's put into how specs can work together, right? So while you have these specifications that are completely independent, if they're used together, then some additional functionality comes into play, right? So one example is MicroProfile config. So I didn't check every single MicroProfile spec, but virtually all of them, if not all of them, utilize MicroProfile config to configure aspects of functionality that are provided by the specification, right? So, for example, with is it fault tolerance? I think it's fault tolerance, where you can override. It's fault tolerance. You can override every annotation. So if you think about @timed, right, where by default it's 1 second, I can go into I can define a property that overrides that 1 second to 10 seconds, right, for instance. And I can do that at the property level, and I can override pretty much every parameter of every fault tolerance annotation using MicroProfile config. So a lot of thought has been put into how these specifications can work together when they're available inside the underlying platform. Another example, REST client integrates with fault tolerance and JAX-RS. So an example there is the REST client. Actually, the REST client basically says that, or is it default tolerance? And one of the specs, it basically says that because fault tolerance annotations basically use the interceptor pattern, that the fault tolerance annotation interceptors have to work with the REST client, right? Again, thought has been put into how these things have to work together. Fault tolerance, the fault tolerance specification. If you have metrics and the fault tolerance implementations with your underlying platform, then fault tolerance will automatically register metrics for you. So I mentioned that there's base metrics that are provided by the platform. There's also vendor metrics, that are specific to an implementation, or you can write your own metrics, and those are called application metrics. So what fault tolerance will do is, imagine if you have a circuit breaker. With a circuit breaker, you have multiple states. You have an open state, a closed state, and a half open state. And what you can do is, well, what happens by default is metrics will, or fault tolerance will actually auto-register metrics related to your circuit breaker state with metrics. So you'll figure out for a particular circuit breaker how much time is spent in the open state, the half open state, or the closed state. And then you could basically create a Grafana dashboard and look at your circuit breakers, right? If you think about the old, what was it? The Hystrix dashboard, you can recreate that using Grafana. And it's all kind of, the metrics registration all happens out of the box. And it's configurable. You can turn it on or you can turn it off. Another example of spec integration, reactive streams operators operate on the reactive messaging pipeline. So I haven't talked about the reactive specs here because there weren't any updates for MicroProfile 3.3, but you can do reactive development with MicroProfile using reactive messaging, which basically streams data between systems. And think about being able to, like you might do within a Java application, you can create a pipeline with just Java Java streams, and you can use operators on it like, flat map and collect and that kind of those kind of operators. And then with MicroProfile reactive messaging, that all happens with back pressure in place because you're doing streams between systems. So it's pretty cool stuff, and they've thought again ahead of time about how these specifications work together. And one last one, it's a little bit esoteric, but OpenAPI is another MicroProfile specification where you can annotate your RESTful APIs to document them, and then external systems can query them. Maybe you have a Swagger UI that you want to use to interact with your application, and OpenAPI is kind of a core spec that lets you document your API. There's integration with the REST client that basically says, well, if you're using the REST client, don't register that with OpenAPI, right? Because you're really referring to an external service, not something that's within your application. Otherwise, I think in the past it would have automatically registered the REST client annotations, which really aren't a part of your app. It's part of some other app that you're calling. So next slide, please. So this is kind of a all-in-one slide where you can take a look at, and again, the link to this slide deck is in the chat, and you can click on any one of these, where you could look at the project page for the spec. You could look at the actual spec PDF or HTML docs. There's Java docs that are available, the TCK. One thing I forgot to link to is there's a book that a bunch of microprofilers wrote called Hands-On with Eclipse MicroProfile, I believe. I think it's a Pact book, Pact Publishing. I apologize for not putting that in here. And it covers more from a end user developer perspective how to use the MicroProfile APIs, right? This, again, is going to be very detailed around specs. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, MicroProfile GraphQL is a new specification. And so basically, if you think about how you typically develop RESTful applications, you make a call to a RESTful endpoint, you get data back, and maybe it's a list of states, and then you want to for each state figure out what the top 5 cities are. Well, for each state, you might have to call another RESTful service endpoint and ask for the top cities. So what you have is a lot of calls back and forth between a microservice and a backend microservice, a front-end microservice and a backend. And so that's a lot of round tripping, increased latency, more load on the backend server, potentially. And what GraphQL does is it basically lets you define and model your RESTful API so that you could actually conduct queries. So it's not quite pure SQL, right, where you're doing these, very complicated queries. But what you can do is model your API and say, you know what, I'm going to call this backend. I'm going to write a query that says, give me the top 5 cities in all states, right, or all provinces, or however that's defined within your geography. And you make one call, and it returns all of that data with just the fields you want in that call. So that's basically what GraphQL is. So there's a modeling language to model your APIs, and then there's the runtime that actually conducts the queries. And so MicroProfile GraphQL kind of has 2 parts. It generates the GraphQL schema, kind of that API model, using annotation, so you can annotate your code, and that model is generated. And it's the runtime engine. There has to be a runtime engine underneath that actually executes the queries, right? So that's what the GraphQL, MicroProfile GraphQL spec does. And it's also a standalone specification. I'm going to, again, explain that here in a second. So next slide, please. And I know, Tanya, I see the cursor moving. I'm still waiting for my screen to update. I think she's trying. Thank you. Okay. So version 1.0 of the GraphQL spec was released today. I provided the link. It's just going to point to the GitHub where that release kind of shows, hey, it's available. So I hope I didn't preempt the GraphQL spec team by stealing any thunder, but I thought since this is a good opportunity, it was released today. So with MicroProfile, there isn't really the concept of a reference implementation like there was in Java EE, but you do have to have an open source implementation in order to release a spec. And so the GraphQL spec is actually implemented in a project called SmallRye, and SmallRye is consumed by other runtimes. So I know Quarkus and Thorntail pull out of SmallRye. OpenLiberty, I think, pulls a couple of MicroProfile implementations out of the SmallRye project, and kind of the implementation behind this initial release was defined in the SmallRye community. So that's smallrye.io if you're an implementer and you want to go take a look and get a jump start on kind of creating your own MicroProfile runtime. So release today. Happy news. Imagine there's balloons and confetti falling right now. Okay, next slide, please.
Call it breaking news. Breaking news.
There we go. Breaking news. Yeah, I was looking for a nice, confetti or balloon type thing, but they were all copyrighted. So, and I'm a horrible artist, so I decided to skip it. So, a little bit about how MicroProfile releases its specs. This provides a little bit of history and some visualization of how we've released our specs over time, right? So the first spec was in late, I think it was like September of 2016, Java 1 of 2016. It was, as a project, it was founded in June of 2016. And you'll see that initially we kind of had this inconsistent cadence. Part of that was because we were moving MicroProfile into the Eclipse Foundation, and that took a little bit of time, and we were learning new processes as a new project. And part of it was because we hadn't really defined a formalized lifecycle early on. So next slide, please. So what you'll see is beginning in the summer, the June release of 2018, we got in this specific cadence. So we kind of talked about it in the MicroProfile community in our live hangout. And again, there's I'm forward referencing a little bit, but we kind of discussed how do we want to go about delivering MicroProfile in some predictable manner. So we decided to go on a train model. We release 3 times per year: February, June, and October. And if you're not ready for a particular, for example, for the February release, well, then you'll have to wait for the June release. So this train has been executing, on time since mid-January. Mid 2018, and until so far we've gotten to 3.3 that we released February 18th. And next slide, please. What you'll see is we've defined a formality around MicroProfile saying major releases are reserved for June releases. So 2.0 happened in June of 2018, 3.0 in June of 2019, 4.0 is scheduled for June of this year, which a major release in MicroProfile, kind of like with semantic versioning in general, means that it's an opportunity to break compatibility, right? This is just true within any project. It's a time when you think, what, we made a decision, maybe it was the wrong decision, maybe we want to correct it, or it's around, it's a feature that nobody really used, so let's get it out of the platform, or it's obsolete, right? It's no longer appropriate in the current programming paradigm or whatever, right? So it's just out of date as a concept. So with MicroProfile, these major releases are opportunities to break compatibility, and so we've already done that in a couple of cases. One example is in metrics. We had a counter, and it was kind of an overloaded counter where it provided dual functionality that was confusing developers. So we split the @counted annotation and added a concurrent gauge annotation to kind of deal with this duality. I don't want to get into too much detail, but what it means is that it did kind of break functionality. And we kind of, we're okay with that in MicroProfile, pretty much. So before I continue on to the next slide and explain that more, what you'll see is we do have 4.0 in planning, and in the June release, in the October release of this calendar year, it's going to be interesting, an interesting release. We'll have to see if it's going to be another incremental release, or we're going to have, if we're going to have to break with our protocol and maybe do 2 major releases in a single year. So next slide, and I'll explain that. So MicroProfile 4.0, as you know, Java EE has moved into the Jakarta community. So it is now Jakarta EE in terms of continuing its evolution. And so MicroProfile relies on the list of specs you can kind of see here. And while with Jakarta EE8, the programming API hasn't changed. So your applications don't necessarily break, but the names of the API jars do change. So that means your pom.xml may have to be updated, right? And our TCKs, for example, had to be updated. Will have to be updated to utilize the right Jakarta API jars. So for us, that's a breaking change. For your code, it's not necessarily a breaking change. It just depends on your MicroProfile runtime and how you define your pom.xml. Worst case, it should just be a pom.xml update. So there's no API changes. There's no Jakarta namespace changes, right? Because in the Jakarta community, we know that we have to change the JavaX namespace to the Jakarta namespace in order to evolve specs, right? That is not what's happening in MicroProfile 4.0 yet. So, but that is going to happen relatively, I think, soon after Jakarta makes that switch in Jakarta EE9. So that's why I said at some point we may have to have 2 releases in a year, unless we want to wait until next June, our next planned breaking release after 4.0. So I'm talking June of 2021, in order to update our MicroProfile specs. And so we may not want to wait that long. Right. Okay, so breaking changes. You can see the list of specs here that have breaking changes or are planning breaking changes. And so this isn't just the API jar dependency breaking changes, these are the specs that are planning maybe functional changes, kind of like were described for the other specs. Some of these might be functionality that your code might rely on, or it might be, again, just spec changes, spec clarifications, TCK updates, and stuff like that. So it's a little bit early, so I didn't want to point anything specific out, but those links do point to the GitHub milestone where we track what's going to be in these releases. So in MicroProfile, to track what's happening in a spec in the next release, we have we formalized as a process that you should define a milestone in what GitHub issues will be used to track what's going to happen in a milestone as it targets the next MicroProfile spec release, right? So you'll see a list of all the planned changes in these specs. Some are breaking potentially. Well, some are going to be breaking in this case. Some not. And this is early, so it's going to be highly volatile. So some things you may see new issues pop in, some issues move out. So just a little bit of a heads up on that. And there's a discussion to remove open tracing from the platform spec, from MicroProfile at the platform level. The reason isn't because open trace, people don't use open tracing. They absolutely want to trace traffic between microservices. The open tracing upstream as a project is merging with open census in a way. So there's two competing specifications for how to do distributed tracing, and they're merging into a single spec called open telemetry. So what we want to do is write an open telemetry spec. We decided to not try and update open tracing to be open telemetry in terms of the MicroProfile spec. We decided to create a separate open telemetry spec. So we may not want to have to wait until the June of 2021 to incorporate that. So that's why we decided, it's a discussion, pulling open tracing out of the core spec. Vendors will still implement it until there's an open telemetry spec and implementation, and then that could be added into the core platform, right? So it's a little bit of process as to why that might be pulled out. Don't read anything like negative into that. It's actually all goodness. Okay, next slide, please. And that discussion about open telemetry kind of falls into a list of things that we are actively discussing within the community. It's all public. We discuss them in the MicroProfile Live Hangout, which, by the way, is in an hour and a half from now. We are trying to figure out how do we adopt the Jakarta namespace. When are we going to do it? Which MicroProfile release? Are we going to wait a full year until 2021, or do we break our policy and do 2 major releases within a single year? So MicroProfile is pretty agile in that respect. Actually, I'm forward referencing again. But we are pretty agile. We do make kind of late decisions. We don't pre-optimize our decision making. So, but we are trying to figure that out. We are trying to figure out Jakarta technical alignment. So if Jakarta EE wants to rely on MicroProfile specs, and we're moving kind of quickly, we have breaking changes once a year, how does that work with Jakarta EE having a very stable set of APIs? So that's a technical alignment discussion. And I'll explain how you can get involved and learn more here in a second. There's also more around organizational structure, and MicroProfile has to create a working group within the Eclipse Foundation. And what that basically means, the reason why that has to be done is because in the move of Java EE to Jakarta in the Eclipse Foundation, there was a recognition that we found a gap in how IP flows from vendors providing functionality down to implementers and out to the end users. So think of it as IP protection, protect everybody along that path. And for that IP to flow properly for specs, then any project that creates specs has to be part of our working group. MicroProfile is not part of our working group currently. So we're discussing, should we have a standalone working group, or should we kind of align more formally in a single working group with Jakarta, right? With Jakarta EE, in some form, right? In some form or another. And so that's an ongoing discussion. And there's this discussion around growing pains, meaning that MicroProfile has 8 homegrown specs that are part of the core platform. We now have 4 standalone specs, and we have a 5th one on the way. That means 13 specs. And so what does it mean to be core? What does it mean to be outside of core? Do we need to maybe have categorize the reactive specs in some special category? Should we get rid of a platform spec or core and standalone together all together as a concept and just have a bunch of individual specs? For now, that's kind of backburnered because of all these other conversations we're having. But it's something that is a background conversation a little bit at the moment. And we're just trying to figure out how the specs should be organized within MicroProfile, right? So next slide, please. And a little bit about the MicroProfile community. So, I'll give you a little bit of background about the active discussions, about a little bit about the specs and how they're created. But from a community perspective, again, I think we're a lot more like an open source project than a standards organization. And this is my personal view. Some may, within MicroProfile, may have a differing view. But we're just not big on process, right? We don't define processes up front. We kind of move forward, and if something pops up and we realize, hey, this is a gap we need to fix, then we create a process, right? So in a lot of ways, this is what drives the agility of MicroProfile to release on the cadence that we've been releasing. So we're very careful about inserting new processes into the way we deliver specs. We use consensus-based decision-making. We hop on a live hangout. If we can't make a decision there, we kind of kick it into the MicroProfile mailing list or Google group, have the discussion there. And it's pretty much decision is consensus-based. And if we can't come to a consensus, to date we have. When we get to the technical alignment and the working group, those are bigger decisions. Then it goes back to rule number 1. Maybe we'll create a process to solve that problem, right? To vote on technical alignment in working groups, right? We meet bi-weekly on a live hangout. It's informally formal, meaning you're not going to go to the live hangout and see this Robert Rules of Order, very strict way of doing things. It's like going to a Java user group in a lot of ways, right? Where we all kind of collaborate and anyone can speak, anyone can ask questions, but we do have some structure, right? We cover the release planning, we cover maybe new functionality, adjusting a process, and so on. So, and if we can't finish it in a live hangout, or if it's a big decision, then we, again, kick it out to the mailing list. And the other thing is anyone can create a MicroProfile specification. It's as easy as joining the Google group or the mailing list and saying, hey, I have an idea. Start the discussion. Others will join in. If people think it's a good idea, it's like, hey, let's all go to the sandbox and try it out, right? And then it can eventually mature into a specification if there's enough kind of buy-in, if you have enough people interested to kind of help you out with it. So anyone can start a specification. So take a look at it. Next slide, please. Go to start.microprofile.io. This is a lot like the start.spring.io for Spring developers, where you can actually create the outline of a project using any one of the MicroProfile runtimes, right? And I'll note that there's also a couple of IDE plugins that will let you generate MicroProfile projects using this backend capability. So VS Code and IntelliJ will actually call into, have extensions to generate projects that really call into the functionality of start.microprofile.io. So if you want to create a project, take a look at that. Next slide. I think this might be the last slide. Where am I at? Yes. Get involved. These are clickable links. If you want to see how to join the MicroProfile call, a live hangout in roughly an hour and a half, Look in the lower left-hand corner. There's a calendar, and it's got all the logistics about how to join the live hangout or any individual spec meeting. If you don't want to start a spec, but you want to maybe join in to an existing conversation, an existing spec, and contribute, all the meetings are in the calendar there. Again, the Google Group link in the upper left-hand project, if you want to kind of join the discussion at the mailing list level, and some additional links as well. So if you're interested, definitely take a look. And last slide. I think I have one more thank you slide. Oh, one more. Oh, this is a shameless plug. I forgot about this one, actually. I do a live training every 2 months at O'Reilly, where it gets into a hands-on work with the various MicroProfile specifications. It's 4 hours, so I can't cover them all, but you can see a list on the left-hand side. If you can't commit to 4 hours, completely understandable, you can go watch the replay, right? So there's a link at the bottom that you can go to and sign up for the live training at O'Reilly. Next slide. And that's it. That's the end. I've been tracking the chat. I don't see a whole lot around questions in the chat, but I'm willing, with the 1 or 2 minutes we have left, to handle questions.
So there is one in the questions and answers section.
Oh.
I'm not sure you can see it, but I will read.
I can.
There is a question. How can we check health check in the production environment?
How do you test it, maybe, in a production environment? Oh, how do you check it? So it depends. You can either, if you're running in Docker, there's a health check capability in Docker where you can either in your Docker file, in your Docker compose file, or even on the Docker run command line, specify a command to run that checks the health of the application. So basically what you'll be doing in the case of Docker, I think, is actually shelling into the container running your app. You run some kind of command that can then check the health check endpoint, right? So, and it does look at the return code of the health check endpoint. So you can see kind of from the Docker perspective, if it's healthy or unhealthy. And I think when you get to Docker Swarm, it will actually provide maybe some additional capability of killing a container and restarting it if it's unhealthy for too long. From a Kubernetes perspective, there's a health check probe that you would define in your YAML, in your deployment YAML, and there you can either do an HTTP. It basically acts as an HTTP. And you can ping the and there's response codes, like I think it's 501 on a failure and a 502. Is it 500 or 501? Anyway, the 500 error range for if an application is either unhealthy or not ready, like I mentioned. So with just a simple YAML command, Kubernetes can check that. Or you can do something as complex, like the Docker use case, shell into your container and actually run a more complete command, part of which might be checking the health check endpoint, but maybe also running some internal commands as well within the container. So the underlying platforms, container orchestration platforms, provide the capability to check. Next slide.
Hey, no more slides.
Or next, sorry, not slide. Any more questions?
Okay, let me see. It seems no questions. So, Ranjit, I hope this answered your question. If there are any more questions, please, now it's the time. If no more questions, then we can close this call. You know where to reach John. You know how to reach me. You know that the same link is to be used for replay of this session. So yeah, please feel free, let us know, and get involved in MicroProfile. Okay. I'm dragging a little bit just to see if there are more questions, but there seems we don't have any questions. John, thank you so much. Reminder that John will update a couple of slides with their titles, and you can also use the slides as well for the reference. Looking forward to the update on 4, so stay tuned for that session once we have that release. Okay. Thanks, everyone, and
Right, thanks,
we'll be
everyone.
Bye.